A quiet breaking point. Have you ever sat in a parked car, engine off, phone dark, hands on the steering wheel, and suddenly felt too tired to even open the door? Not tired in your body, tired in your head. That was me on a cold afternoon in the United States, long after I had technically made it. New country, stable job, a family, English everywhere. And yet my mind felt like a browser with 40 tabs open, all playing different sounds, none of them useful. That moment was the first time I truly understood why Americans keep talking about mental health and why ignoring your mind is far more dangerous than failing an English test. Nobody warns you about this part when you move to the US. People talk about opportunities, freedom, better education. They do not talk about the quiet pressure that builds when everything around you works, but your brain does not. The streets were clean. The systems were efficient. The weather, depending on the state, followed rules you could predict. But inside my head, nothing followed rules anymore. I was learning English every day, listening, reading, repeating sentences slowly like a good student, yet I felt myself slipping. Not backward in language, downward in spirit. You might think burnout comes from doing too much. In my case, it came from trying too hard to be normal. Normal immigrant, normal spouse, normal parent, normal English learner. Your brain hates that word. Normal gives it no room to breathe. Neuroscience explains this simply. Prolonged cognitive load without emotional processing increases cortisol, the stress hormone. High cortisol does not just make you anxious. It directly interferes with memory formation. In other words, the more stressed you are, the worse your English listening becomes, even if you practice more. Your brain is not lazy. It is protecting itself. At that time, I blamed myself. I thought my accent was the problem, or my age, or my lack of talent. That is what many English learners do. They personalize a neurological response. But one evening, during a routine checkup, my American doctor asked a question no teacher had ever asked me. How is your mental health? Not, are you depressed? Not, are you sick? Just that. Calm. Neutral. As if asking about blood pressure. I laughed it off. He didn't. He explained very plainly that in the US, mental health is treated as preventive care. You do not wait until the engine explodes to check the oil. Chronic stress, he said, quietly damages attention span, sleep quality, emotional regulation, and language processing. Studies from the American Psychological Association show that long-term stress reduces activity in the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for focus and decision-making. That includes understanding spoken English. Suddenly, my struggles made sense. Not emotionally. Biologically. That night, I noticed something strange. When I stopped forcing myself to study English and instead listened to a slow, simple story, one that sounded like real life, not a textbook, my chest loosened. My breathing slowed. I understood. More, not less. This is not magic. It is called cognitive safety. Your brain learns best when it does not feel threatened. Americans protect mental health because they understand one core truth. A calm mind learns faster than a scared one. Think about how often you try to learn English while judging yourself. Every mistake becomes evidence. Every pause feels like failure. Your nervous system cannot tell the difference between a tiger and a critical inner voice. To your brain, both are danger. When danger is present, language shuts down. Survival takes over. This is why yelling at yourself never works. You are basically asking your brain to write poetry during a fire alarm. I began to notice how Americans talk about this openly. Coworkers said things like, "I need a mental health day." Parents discussed children's feelings before grades. Schools sent emails about emotional well-being alongside academic progress. At first, it felt excessive. Then I realized something uncomfortable. They were not weaker. They were more regulated. Emotional regulation is not softness. It is skill. Here is a practical shift that changed everything for me. Instead of asking, "Did I study enough English today?" I asked, "Did my mind feel safe today?" If the answer was no, I slowed down. I chose easier content. I repeated simple sentences without pressure. I allowed silence. Research in second language acquisition confirms this approach. Comprehensible input, language slightly below your stress threshold, produces better long-term fluency than aggressive drilling. Slow is not failure. Slow is strategic. That parked car moment was not the end. It was a signal. My mind was asking for care, not criticism. Americans protect mental health because they learned, sometimes the hard way, that productivity without psychological health eventually collapses. Language learning is no different. You cannot build fluency on a cracked foundation. If you are listening to this and thinking, "That sounds like me," good. Awareness is the first form of recovery. You do not need motivation. You need permission to learn gently, to rest mentally, to stop treating your brain like an enemy. Because the truth is simple and slightly ironic. The moment you stop attacking your mind, it finally starts working with you. Climate changed my mind. Nobody tells you that climate can rewire your thoughts. Not metaphorically. Literally. I learned this the slow way, by living through 4 seasons in the United States and realizing my moods were no longer fully mine. One winter morning, I woke up in silence so heavy it felt padded. No birds. No street noise. Just cold light pressing against the window. My body was fine, but my mind felt muted, like someone had turned the volume knob down. That was the first time I understood that where you live can quietly change how you think, feel, and even learn English. You might assume climate is just about temperature. Hot or cold. Rain or snow. But your brain does not experience weather as data. It experiences it as stimulus. Sunlight affects serotonin production. Temperature influences sleep quality. Seasonal changes alter circadian rhythms. All of this feeds directly into attention span and emotional stability. In the U.S., these differences are extreme. Florida sun is not California sun. Midwest winter is not New York winter. When I moved states, my English listening improved without extra practice. That confused me, until science caught up with my experience. Research from Harvard Medical School shows that reduced sunlight exposure increases the risk of seasonal affective symptoms, including low motivation and slower cognitive processing. That means when days are short and gray, your brain literally processes information more slowly. Not because you are weak. Because neurons fire differently. I noticed this clearly in winter. I replayed simple English sentences more times. I lost patience faster. My inner critic became louder. The language did not change. The weather did. Americans talk about this openly. They plan vacations around sunlight. They use light therapy lamps. Schools adjust schedules. Offices encourage breaks. Mental health policies in the U.S. recognize environmental stressors as real contributors to cognitive fatigue. This was shocking to me at first. In my old mindset, struggle was personal. In the American mindset, struggle is contextual. That shift alone lifted a huge weight off my shoulders. Here is something subtle but important. Climate also shapes culture, and culture shapes communication. In colder regions, people value personal space and predictability. In warmer climates, conversations are longer, slower, more expressive. When you learn English through real stories, not textbooks, you absorb these rhythms naturally. I found that my listening comprehension improved when I matched my learning pace to the environment instead of fighting it. On quiet winter evenings, I chose calm narratives. In summer, I practiced conversation. Same language. Different climate strategy. Your brain loves patterns. Climate creates patterns long before language enters the picture. For example, extreme heat increases irritability and reduces working memory capacity. Studies published in Nature Climate Change confirm that higher temperatures correlate with reduced cognitive performance. That explains why some days, even simple English felt heavy. I stopped blaming myself. I started adjusting. Shorter sessions. Slower speech. More repetition without judgment. This is where Americans are quietly practical. They normalize adaptation. If the weather changes, you change your routine. Nobody calls that laziness. They call it self-management. When I applied this logic to English learning, everything softened. On gloomy days, I allowed myself to just listen. No speaking. No pressure. On bright days, I spoke more. My progress stabilized, not because I worked harder, but because I worked with my environment. There is also the emotional layer. Climate affects memory through emotion. Your brain remembers better when emotions are regulated. If weather consistently lowers your mood, your retention drops. That is not opinion. That is neuroscience. The amygdala, responsible for emotional processing, interacts directly with the hippocampus, which forms memories. Stressful environmental conditions hijack that connection. Americans protect mental health partly because they understand environment matters. You cannot meditate your way out of a snowstorm inside your head. One evening, during a long winter, I noticed my child thriving while I struggled. Schools had prepared indoor lighting, emotional check-ins, physical movement breaks. My child was learning language faster than me, not because of age alone, but because the system respected mental climate. That realization stung, but it taught me something valuable. Language learning is not about discipline. It is about conditions. So here is a concrete practice that helped me and might help you. Before starting English practice, ask one question. What does my mind need today based on where I am? Not emotionally dramatic, just observant. If it is dark and cold, slow down. Choose stories, not drills. If it is bright and warm, speak more. Match your method to the climate inside and outside you. This aligns with cognitive load theory, which shows that learning efficiency increases when extraneous stressors are minimized. Climate changed my mind because it forced me to stop pretending my brain was a machine. It is a living system, sensitive to light, temperature, rhythm, and rest. Americans do not protect mental health because they are fragile. They do it because they are pragmatic. They learned that ignoring the environment leads to burnout, and burnout kills learning faster than any accent ever could. Once I stopped fighting the weather, my English stopped fighting me. Turns out, your mind does not need to be pushed. It needs to be understood. Culture shock inside the head. Culture shock is supposed to be loud. New food. New rules. New accents. People imagine embarrassment in public, wrong gestures, awkward silence. But the most dangerous culture shock I experienced in the United States made no sound at all. It happened quietly inside my head while I was doing everything right. I worked. I studied English. I smiled politely. And yet my thoughts felt slightly out of sync, like audio delayed by half a second. That delay was not linguistic. It was psychological. You may not notice it at first. Your brain is excellent at pretending everything is fine. But slowly, small things begin to drain you. Conversations feel heavier than they should. Jokes land late. Instructions make sense, but only after extra effort. At night, your mind replays ordinary moments as if they were mistakes. This is not stupidity. It is cognitive dissonance, the stress that occurs when you're internal. Cultural framework no longer matches your environment. In the US, this gap can be subtle and relentless. Here is what surprised me. Americans rarely talk about culture shock as an external problem. They talk about it as an internal adjustment. Therapists, counselors, even workplace managers recognize that adapting to American culture requires mental recalibration. Studies in cross-cultural psychology show that prolonged exposure to unfamiliar social norms increases mental fatigue, even when language proficiency is high. Your brain is constantly decoding invisible rules. That decoding costs energy. For example, Americans value directness, but they soften it with friendliness. They say, "How are you?" without expecting a real answer. They praise effort openly. They apologize easily. None of this is wrong, but it requires constant interpretation. When you are learning English, this doubles the load. You are not just translating words. You are translating intention. Your prefrontal cortex works overtime, monitoring tone, timing, and emotional cues. After a while, it gets tired. When it gets tired, learning slows. I noticed this most clearly during meetings. I understood the English, but I left exhausted, as if I had run a mental marathon. Neuroscience explains why. The brain consumes glucose when making decisions. Cultural ambiguity increases decision-making frequency. Every smile, pause, or joke requires evaluation. Should I respond? How fast? How honest? Over time, this decision fatigue reduces working memory. That is why, later at home, even simple English listening felt harder. My brain had already spent its budget. Americans protect mental health partly because they accept this cost as real. Many companies provide cultural orientation, mentoring, and psychological support, not as charity, but as efficiency. A regulated mind adapts faster. An exhausted mind resists change. When I finally spoke to a counselor, they did not ask me to try harder. They asked me to normalize the fatigue. That single reframing reduced my stress more than any grammar rule ever did. There is also the identity layer. In American culture, you're encouraged to be yourself. That sounds freeing until you realize you are still figuring out who that self is in a new context. Back home, your identity was reinforced daily by shared assumptions. In the US, those assumptions disappear. Your brain enters a constant state of low-level vigilance. Psychologists call this acculturative stress. Symptoms include irritability, sleep disruption, and reduced concentration, all enemies of language acquisition. I made a critical mistake early on. I treated culture shock as a motivation problem. I pushed more English input, more podcasts, more repetition. But learning science is clear. Stress impairs consolidation. Information enters short-term memory, but fails to transfer into long-term storage. That is why you feel like you understand today and forget tomorrow. It is not your memory. It is your nervous system. Once I understood this, I changed one habit that changed everything. I stopped multitasking culture and language at the same time. When I practiced English, I chose content rooted in familiar emotions, family stories, daily routines, simple reflections. Nothing abstract. Nothing ironic. This reduced cultural decoding and freed cognitive resources for language itself. Research on cognitive load theory supports this approach. Reduce extraneous load, and intrinsic learning improves. Americans do this intuitively. They separate contexts. Work is work. Therapy is therapy. Learning is learning. They do not expect the brain to juggle everything at once. That boundary setting is not indulgent. It is strategic. When I adopted it, my listening improved. My speaking became calmer. My inner dialogue softened. Culture shock did not disappear, but it stopped hijacking my learning. Here is another uncomfortable truth. Culture shock can mimic personal failure. When you feel slow, you assume you are inadequate. In reality, your brain is busy rebuilding maps. New social rules require new neural pathways. Neuroplasticity takes time and rest. Americans invest in mental health because they value long-term adaptation over short-term performance. They understand that pressure delays integration. If you are struggling with English in the US or any foreign environment, ask yourself one honest question. Am I tired of the language or tired of decoding the world? The answer matters. One requires practice. The other requires compassion. Culture shock lives inside the head, not on the streets. Once you recognize it, you stop fighting yourself. And when you stop fighting yourself, your mind finally has the space to learn. Why Americans talk about feelings. Imagine walking into an office meeting and someone says, calmly, I'm not in a good headspace today. No whisper. No apology. Just information. The first time I heard this in the United States, my brain froze for a second. Where I came from, feelings were background noise. You worked first, felt later. Or never. In America, people name their emotions the way they name calendar dates. And that simple habit quietly explains why they protect mental health so fiercely. At first, it felt excessive. Too soft. Too emotional. Why talk about feelings when there is work to do, English to learn, life to manage? But then I noticed something strange. The people who talked about their emotions the most often seemed calmer, not weaker. They recovered faster from stress. They learned faster. They moved on without dragging invisible weight behind them. Science explains why. Labeling emotions reduces activity in the amygdala, the brain's alarm system, and increases regulation in the prefrontal cortex. In simple terms, naming what you feel makes your brain safer. You may think emotions slow you down. In reality, unspoken emotions do. When feelings stay unnamed, they leak into cognition. They hijack attention. They distort memory. This matters deeply for language learning, listening comprehension, especially in a second language, requires sustained attention. If part of your brain is busy suppressing emotion, less capacity remains for processing sound and meaning. Americans talk about feelings, not to complain, but to clear cognitive space. I experienced this shift during a small, ordinary conversation. A colleague noticed I was unusually quiet and asked, "Are you overwhelmed?" That word hit me harder than expected. Overwhelmed. Not lazy. Not unprepared. Just overloaded. I said yes. The conversation ended there. No advice. No judgment. And something in my chest loosened. That evening, my English listening felt easier. Same material. Different mental state. Psychological research supports this link. Studies published in the Journal of Experimental Psychology show that emotional suppression increases cognitive load and reduces working memory performance. Emotional expression, when regulated, does the opposite. It frees resources. Americans normalize emotional expression because they prioritize functional minds. A calm, regulated brain is more productive than a silent, tense one. This cultural habit also shows up in families. Parents ask children how they feel before asking what they learned. Schools include emotional literacy alongside academics. This is not accidental. Developmental psychology demonstrates that children who can identify emotions develop stronger executive function skills. Executive function underpins planning, focus, and language acquisition. In other words, talking about feelings supports learning, not distracts from it. I realized I had been doing the opposite. I treated emotions as obstacles. When English felt hard, I pushed harder. When frustration appeared, I ignored it. That strategy worked for a while, then collapsed. My nervous system reached a limit. Americans do not wait for collapse. They intervene earlier. Therapy is not a last resort. It is maintenance. Just like exercise. Here is where this matters for you. If you are learning English and constantly telling yourself to ignore how you feel, you are asking your brain to perform under threat. Your nervous system interprets emotional suppression as danger. Learning shuts down. This is not weakness. It is biology. The vagus nerve, which regulates stress response, influences vocal tone, breathing, and auditory processing. A dysregulated nervous system literally hears less accurately. I began practicing a simple habit. Before starting English practice, I named one feeling out loud. Just one. Tired. Anxious. Okay. No analysis. No drama. Research on affect labeling shows that even minimal emotional naming reduces stress responses. After that, I practiced English slowly. My comprehension improved. My patience increased. My inner critic softened. Americans also separate emotion from identity. Feeling stressed does not mean you are a failure. It means you are human in a demanding context. This distinction matters. When emotion becomes identity, shame appears. Shame shuts down learning. By externalizing feelings, talking about them as temporary states, Americans avoid that trap. Another subtle point, talking about feelings creates connection. Connection regulates the nervous system. Social neuroscience confirms that perceived social safety enhances learning capacity. When you feel understood, your brain relaxes. Language flows more easily. This is why learning English through personal stories works. Stories carry emotion, and emotion anchors memory. I once asked an American friend why people here talk about feelings so openly. She answered simply, because pretending doesn't work. That sentence stayed with me. Pretending consumes energy. Honesty saves it. Americans protect mental health because they value efficiency, not emotional drama, but emotional clarity. If you take one thing from this section, let it be this. You do not need to feel good to learn English, but you need to feel safe. Safety begins with awareness. Awareness begins with naming. Talk about feelings not to dwell, but to move forward without invisible resistance. When emotion stops fighting you, language stops hiding from you. English learning burnout. Burnout does not arrive screaming. It whispers. One day, you sit down to listen to English, press play, and feel nothing. No curiosity. No resistance. Just a flat, empty patience that scares you more than frustration ever did. I remember that moment clearly. The audio was slow. The vocabulary was simple. Everything was appropriate for my level. And yet my brain refused to engage. That was when I realized I was not failing English. I was burned out from surviving it. You may think burnout comes from studying too much. In reality, it often comes from studying without meaning. Repeating sounds, shadowing sentences, memorizing phrases, these are not harmful by themselves. But when they happen under constant pressure, your nervous system begins to associate English with threat. Threat does not need to be dramatic. It can be quiet, persistent self-judgment. I should be better by now. Others learn faster. Why am I still slow? Each thought adds weight. Eventually, your brain chooses numbness as protection. Neuroscience explains this clearly. Chronic stress reduces dopamine sensitivity. Dopamine is not just about pleasure. It is about motivation and learning. When dopamine signaling drops, effort feels heavier, rewards feel smaller, and progress feels invisible. This is classic burnout. You are still functioning, but the spark is gone. Americans recognize burnout as a mental health issue, not a character flaw. That distinction matters more than it sounds. I noticed something ironic. The harder I tried to fix my English burnout, the worse it became. I added more structure, more schedules, more goals. My calendar looked impressive. My mind felt trapped. Cognitive psychology calls this over-control. When learning becomes rigid, intrinsic motivation collapses. Language especially resists force. It grows through exposure, curiosity, and emotional Relevance, not pressure. Americans talk about burnout openly because ignoring it is expensive. Burnout leads to absenteeism, errors, and long-term disengagement. In learning, it leads to plateau. You may still understand simple sentences, but growth stops. This is not because your brain reached its limit. It is because your emotional system pulled the emergency brake. One afternoon, after weeks of forcing myself to study, I did something that felt irresponsible. I stopped. Not forever. Just temporarily. I listened to English without trying to learn. No pausing. No repeating. Just background sound while cooking dinner. At first, guilt followed me around the kitchen. Then something unexpected happened. A sentence caught my attention. Then another. No effort. Just interest. That is how recovery starts, not with discipline, but with permission. Psychological studies on burnout recovery emphasize autonomy. When people regain a sense of choice, motivation slowly returns. Americans design mental health interventions around this principle. You do not fix burnout by pushing harder. You fix it by restoring control. For English learners, this means choosing content that feels human, not instructional. Stories, conversations, imperfect speech, real life. Another factor in burnout is identity pressure. When English becomes tied to self-worth, every mistake feels personal. Your brain cannot separate performance from value. This activates the threat system. Cortisol rises. Learning efficiency drops. Americans counter this by separating skill from identity. You are not your productivity. You are not your accent. This separation protects mental health and supports long-term growth. I began practicing English in ways that did not look like studying. Talking to my child about simple daily things. Listening to slow stories that mirrored my life. Reading short texts without translating every word. These activities lowered my stress response. According to second language acquisition research, low anxiety environments facilitate deeper processing. Burnout eased not because I did less English, but because English stopped feeling like a test. Here is a practical sign you may be burned out. You avoid English not because it is hard, but because it feels emotionally heavy. That heaviness is information. Ignoring it delays recovery. Americans listen to that signal. Mental health policies encourage breaks before collapse. Rest is not a reward. It is maintenance. One more uncomfortable truth. Burnout can coexist with progress. You may objectively improve while subjectively feeling worse. This mismatch confuses learners. You think something is wrong with you. In reality, your emotional system is lagging behind your cognitive gains. Without emotional recovery, progress feels hollow. Recognizing this gap prevents self-blame. If you are there right now, listening but not feeling, practicing but not caring, pause. Not to quit. To recalibrate. Ask yourself one honest question. What part of this feels unsafe? Not difficult. Unsafe. Then adjust. Slower input. Shorter sessions. More relevance. Less judgment. This is not lowering standards. It is aligning with biology. Burnout is your mind's way of saying it needs care, not correction. Americans protect mental health because they learned that ignoring burnout turns small problems into permanent ones. Language learning is a long journey. You cannot walk it while dragging emotional weight. When English stops being a battlefield, curiosity quietly returns. And curiosity, not pressure, is what carries you forward. Mental health is not weakness. Picture a fire alarm going off in your house. You do not argue with it. You do not call it weak. You check the fire. In the United States, mental health is treated the same way. Stress, anxiety, exhaustion. These are signals, not moral failures. When I first understood this, it felt almost offensive. I had been trained to endure, not to listen. Endurance was strength. Silence was maturity. And yet, the more I endured without acknowledging my mental state, the less capable I became. That contradiction forced me to rethink everything I believed about weakness. You may have learned, like I did, that asking for help means you failed to manage yourself. Americans flipped that logic. Here, asking for help is considered risk management. Schools, workplaces, and even insurance systems treat mental health as infrastructure. Therapy is not hidden. Counseling is not whispered about. Policies are built around the assumption that minds need maintenance. This is not emotional softness. It is operational thinking. Neuroscience supports this approach. Chronic stress alters the hippocampus, the brain region responsible for learning and memory. Long-term exposure to stress hormones shrinks neural connections. This is not a personality issue. It is physical change. Addressing mental health early prevents damage that later requires more effort to reverse. Americans learned that prevention is cheaper than repair. That logic applies directly to language learning. I used to think pushing through discomfort would make me stronger. Sometimes it does. But pushing through psychological overload does the opposite. It teaches your brain to associate learning with pain. Over time, your nervous system resists engagement. You may still show up, but part of you is missing. This is why Americans normalize mental health days. Rest is not escape. It is recalibration. One moment changed my perspective completely. At work, a colleague took time off, not for illness, not for vacation, but for mental health. No explanation required. No apology. The project continued. The world did not collapse. When she returned, she was sharper, calmer, more effective. That single example did more to convince me than any article. Weakness does not recover. Regulation does. Psychology calls this self-regulation capacity. When your emotional system is balanced, your cognitive system performs better. Studies in occupational psychology show that employees with access to mental health support demonstrate higher learning rates and adaptability. Americans invest in mental health because it directly improves performance. This is not idealism. It is data-driven. Pragmatism. I applied this idea to my English practice. Instead of forcing daily progress, I monitored mental state. If my mind felt foggy, I listened passively. If it felt alert, I spoke. This flexible approach aligns with the Yerkes-Dodson law, which describes the relationship between arousal and performance. Too little stress leads to boredom. Too much leads to breakdown. Optimal learning happens in the middle. Americans design systems to keep people in that zone. Another misconception I had was that mental health care is only for crisis. In the U.S., it is normalized as routine. You do not wait until you are drowning to learn how to swim. Preventive therapy teaches emotional skills before breakdown occurs. These skills, naming emotions, setting boundaries, Recognizing limits directly support language learning. A regulated speaker communicates more clearly, even with limited vocabulary. I also noticed how Americans talk to children. When a child is overwhelmed, adults intervene. They do not say, "Be stronger." They say, "Take a break." This teaches the nervous system that rest is safe. Adults raised with this mindset carry it into learning. They know when to pause. They know when to ask for support. That is not weakness. That is literacy of the mind. If you grew up without this model, adopting it can feel uncomfortable. You may feel lazy when resting, guilty when slowing down. But guilt is not evidence. It is conditioning. Your brain learns certain rules early. You can update them. Neuroplasticity does not stop with age. It responds to experience. Here is a concrete practice I borrowed from American mental health culture. I separated effort from worth. After an English session, I evaluated process, not identity. Was the input clear? Was my mind focused? Not, am I good enough? This reduced emotional noise. Learning became technical again, not personal. That shift alone increased consistency. Americans protect mental health because they understand one hard truth. Ignoring the mind makes everything else harder. Learning, relationships, work, all suffer. Strength is not endless. Endurance. Strength is responsiveness. The ability to adjust before breaking. If you are pushing yourself right now, ask a different question. Not, how much can I handle, but what helps me recover? Recovery is not retreat. It is preparation. Mental health is not weakness. It is the system that allows strength to last. Love under pressure. Nobody prepares you for how pressure enters a marriage quietly, wearing practical clothes. Bills. Schedules. Immigration paperwork. School emails. And in my case, English, always English, hovering in the background like unfinished business. Love does not break loudly in the United States. It thins. Slowly. Politely. Until one day you realize you are talking about logistics instead of feelings, survival instead of connection. That was when I understood how mental health, language learning, and love are never separate stories. You may believe love problems come from conflict. Often, they come from exhaustion. When both partners are mentally overloaded, empathy becomes optional. Small misunderstandings feel personal. Silence feels safer than explanation, especially in a second language. I noticed this pattern in myself first. After long days of navigating English and American culture, my patience was gone. Not anger. Absence. Emotional absence is harder to repair because it does not look like a problem until it is. Psychology explains this clearly. Chronic stress reduces emotional attunement, the ability to read and respond to your partner's emotional cues. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for empathy and perspective taking, is impaired under stress. When your mind is busy surviving, love becomes a background process. Americans talk about mental health in relationships because they understand this connection. A stressed mind cannot sustain intimacy. My partner and I argued about trivial things. Tone. Timing. Words. English made everything sharper. When you cannot express nuance easily, emotions compress. A sentence that should sound gentle comes out flat. A joke misses its landing. Over time, both sides start assuming the worst. This is not a language problem. It is a nervous system problem. In American culture, couples talk about mental load openly. Therapy is not a last resort after betrayal or disaster. It is maintenance. I resisted this idea at first. Love should be private. Strong couples should figure it out alone. But research in relationship psychology shows that couples who address stress early report higher long-term satisfaction. Americans normalize this because they prioritize sustainability over pride. One evening, after another quiet dinner, filled with unspoken tension, we did something simple. We stopped trying to solve anything. We named one feeling each. Just one. Tired. Overwhelmed. No blame. No explanation. That moment shifted the atmosphere more than any argument ever had. Emotional labeling reduced defensiveness. This is supported by effective neuroscience. Naming emotions reduces amygdala activation, allowing connection. To resume, I realized I had been bringing English frustration into the relationship without noticing. When language feels like constant evaluation, you carry that vigilance home. Your partner becomes another audience, another place to perform. That erodes safety. Americans protect mental health partly because they want homes to be places of recovery, not continuation of stress. We made a small but powerful adjustment. At home, English practice stopped being a performance. No correction unless requested. No pressure to improve. Language became functional again, used to connect, not to measure. This reduced anxiety immediately. Research in bilingual family dynamics confirms that low-pressure language environments improve both communication and emotional bonding. Another cultural difference stood out. In the U.S., expressing vulnerability in relationships is considered strength. Saying, "I'm not okay," invites support, not judgment. This expectation changes how couples handle pressure. Instead of hiding stress, they distribute it. Shared load is lighter. In contrast, silence concentrates stress until it leaks out sideways. Mental health policies in the U.S. support families indirectly. Parental leave, counseling access, workplace flexibility. These are not romantic gestures. They are structural supports that protect relationships. Americans learned that love does not survive on intention alone. It needs conditions. I began to see how my own resistance to vulnerability created distance. I wanted to protect my partner from my struggles. In reality, I was protecting my pride. That pride cost us closeness. Once I reframed vulnerability as information rather than weakness, communication improved. English mistakes mattered less. Tone softened. Humor returned. Here is a practical insight if you are learning English while maintaining a relationship. Separate language frustration from relational meaning. If a conversation feels heavy, ask, "Is this about us or about my exhausted mind?" That question alone prevents many unnecessary conflicts. Cognitive overload distorts perception. Americans teach emotional literacy to counter this distortion. Over time, we learn to schedule recovery together. Walks, quiet evenings, shared listening to simple stories in English. No goal, just presence. Neuroscience shows that shared calm experiences synchronize nervous systems. This synchronization restores trust faster than problem-solving ever could. Love under pressure does not require grand solutions. It requires regulation. Americans protect mental health because regulated individuals build regulated relationships. Regulated relationships survive stress. When the mind is cared for, love stops feeling like work. It feels like home again. Small habits that saved us. Big changes make good headlines. Small habits save real lives. I learned this slowly, through embarrassment, failed routines, and one quiet realization. My mind did not need inspiration. It needed rhythm. In the United States, people rarely wait for motivation to return. They build systems gentle enough to function even on bad days. That philosophy quietly rescued my mental health, my English learning, and my family, without drama, without miracles. At first, I searched for solutions that looked impressive. Morning routines, productivity apps, perfect schedules. They all failed. Not because they were wrong, but because they were too heavy. When your mind is already overloaded, adding structure feels like adding furniture to a room with no space to move. Americans understand this intuitively. They design habits that require almost no willpower. Habits that work when you are tired, distracted, or emotionally flat. The first habit that changed everything was embarrassingly small. 10 minutes. Not studying. Just listening. Same time every evening. Same chair. Same slow English voice. No pausing. No repeating. No goal. Neuroscience calls this habit stacking and cue-based learning. When a behavior is tied to a stable cue, the brain resists less. Over time, my nervous system began associating that chair with calm instead of effort. Learning followed naturally. Another habit surprised me. Walking. Americans walk a lot, not for exercise alone, but for regulation. Research shows that light physical movement improves memory consolidation and reduces anxiety. I started taking short walks while listening to simple English stories. The movement calmed my body. The language slipped in without resistance. My comprehension improved not because I concentrated harder, but because I stopped clenching. At home, we adopted micropauses. Before difficult conversations, we paused for 30 seconds. No phones. Just breathing. This sounds trivial until you understand its impact. Slow breathing activates the parasympathetic nervous system, reducing stress hormones. When stress drops, communication improves. English sentences came out softer. Listening became easier. Misunderstandings decreased. That pause saved more arguments than any communication technique ever did. Americans also normalize habit flexibility. Miss a day? Continue tomorrow. No punishment. No shame. Shame is a habit killer. Behavioral psychology confirms this. Self-compassion predicts long-term habit adherence better than self-discipline. I stopped restarting from zero every time I failed. I resumed. Progress stopped feeling fragile. One habit that helped my children helped me too. Emotional check-ins. At dinner, we each named one feeling from the day. No explanation required. This trained emotional awareness without analysis. Over time, my vocabulary expanded, not academic words, but emotional ones. That mattered. Language sticks when it connects to lived experience. Emotional relevance increases retention. This is supported by effective learning theory. Feelings anchor memory. I also learned from American schools something powerful: limit exposure, increase consistency. Instead of binge learning English on weekends, I practiced briefly every day. Distributed practice outperforms massed practice. 10 minutes daily beats 2 hours weekly. My brain retained more with less effort. Small habits compound quietly. Another habit saved my sleep. I stopped studying English right before bed. Instead, I listened passively. Sleep research shows that cognitive arousal before sleep impairs memory consolidation. Passive exposure reduced arousal, while still reinforcing familiarity. I woke up less anxious. My listening improved during the day. Sleep became part of the learning system, not a casualty. At work, I borrowed an American concept: boundaries as productivity tools. I limited English improvement goals to one area at a time. Listening first, speaking later. Multi-target learning increases cognitive load. Single-focus habits reduce stress and increase clarity. This prevented overwhelm. Progress felt manageable. The most important habit, however, had nothing to do with English directly. It was asking one question daily. What made today easier? Not better. Easier. This shifted my attention toward support instead of struggle. Positive psychology research shows that focusing on ease increases resilience. My brain learned to notice what worked. That reinforced calm behaviors. Over time, these small habits synchronized. Calm mind. Gentle learning. Softer communication. Love stabilized. English improved. Not quickly. Steadily. Americans protect mental health because they trust accumulation. They do not rely on willpower spikes. They build environments where small actions succeed repeatedly. If you are overwhelmed, forget transformation. Choose reduction. Reduce effort. Reduce judgment. Reduce noise. Then add one small habit that feels almost too easy. That is where recovery begins. Big changes impress others. Small habits save you. Children and emotional safety. Children notice everything you try to hide. Your tone. Your pauses. The way your eyes hesitate before answering a simple question. I learned this in the United States, not from a book, but from my own child, who once asked, very casually, "Why do you look tired when you speak English?" That question landed softly and cut deeply. It revealed something I had missed. My mental health was not just mine. It was shaping the emotional climate of my family, especially the smallest members. In American culture, emotional safety for children is treated as non-negotiable, not optional, not a reward for good behavior. Schools talk about it. Pediatricians ask about it. Parents plan around it. At first, this felt excessive to me. Children should adapt. I thought, life is hard. But neuroscience disagrees. A child's brain develops best in environments where emotional signals are predictable and safe. Stress in caregivers transfers directly to children through tone, facial expression, and behavior. You do not need to explain stress for it to be felt. I saw this clearly when my English learning stress peaked. I was present physically, but mentally tense. Conversations at home became efficient, not warm. Instructions replaced curiosity. My child became quieter, not unhappy, Careful. That scared me more than misbehavior ever could. Developmental psychology calls this emotional attunement. When caregivers are dysregulated, children adapt by reducing emotional expression. It looks like maturity. It is actually self-protection. Americans protect mental health because they understand this chain reaction. Emotional regulation in adults creates safety for children. Safety allows exploration. Exploration fuels learning. This applies to language too. Children learn language fastest in emotionally safe environments. Pressure slows them down. I realized I was unintentionally modeling the opposite. Schools in the U.S. reinforced this lesson. Teachers asked students how they felt before starting lessons. Emotional check-ins were routine, not therapy. Maintenance. Research in educational psychology shows that emotionally supported students demonstrate better attention, memory, and language acquisition. Safety is not a soft value. It is a cognitive advantage. I started changing one small thing at home. When my child spoke English imperfectly, I stopped correcting immediately. I listened first. I responded to meaning, not form. This mirrors American classroom practice. Correct too early. And children associate language with evaluation. Delay correction, and they associate it with connection. The difference is subtle. The impact is enormous. Something unexpected happened. My own anxiety dropped. By prioritizing emotional safety for my child, I created it for myself. Our conversations slowed. Laughter returned. English became a shared tool, not a test. Family language researchers confirm this dynamic. Low-pressure bilingual environments benefit both children and adults. Emotional safety is contagious. Another American habit stood out. Parents openly apologize to children. Not theatrically. Simply, I was stressed. That wasn't about you. This teaches children that emotions are manageable and reparable. It also reduces guilt. Guilt is a heavy emotion for children. When they sense parental stress without explanation, they often assume responsibility. Americans interrupt that pattern early. I practiced this. When English frustration leaked into my tone, I named it. Briefly. No over-explaining. My child relaxed visibly. That moment taught me something humbling. Protecting my mental health was not selfish. It was protective parenting. Science explains why this matters. Chronic exposure to stress hormones in childhood affects neural development, particularly in areas related to language and emotional regulation. Emotional safety buffers these effects. Americans invest in mental health to protect future cognitive capacity. They think in generations. I also noticed how American families normalize emotional vocabulary. Children learn words like frustrated, overwhelmed, excited early. This emotional literacy supports self-regulation. Children who can name feelings manage them better. Better regulation supports attention. Attention supports learning. The chain is consistent. At home, we introduced a simple practice. Each day, one feeling word. No explanation required. Over time, my English emotional vocabulary expanded naturally. Not academic. Useful. Language tied to lived experience sticks. This is supported by embodied cognition research. The body remembers what the mind lives. One more realization surprised me. Children do not need perfect parents. They need regulated ones. American culture emphasizes repair over perfection. Mistakes are expected. Repair builds trust. Trust builds safety. Safety builds resilience. That cycle protects mental health far more effectively than control ever could. If you are learning English while raising children, remember this: your pace sets the emotional tempo. Slow is not harmful. Tenses. Your child does not need you fluent. They need you present. Presence requires mental health. Children learn how to treat their minds by watching how you treat yours. Americans protect mental health because they want children who feel safe enough to grow, speak, and explore without fear. When emotional safety becomes the priority, language follows naturally, quietly, steadily, and together. Thinking in English slowly. At some point, you stop translating. Not because you are fluent, but because you are tired. Tired of the delay. Tired of the mental traffic jam where every sentence queues up behind your native language, waiting for permission to exist. I reached that point one ordinary afternoon in the United States, standing in a grocery store aisle, staring at cereal boxes, when a simple thought appeared in English, slow, imperfect, but uninvited. It did not ask for translation. It just arrived. That was the moment I learned that thinking in English is not something you force. It is something you allow. Most people believe thinking in English means speed, fast responses, automatic phrases, zero hesitation. That belief creates pressure, and pressure slows the brain. Cognitive science tells us that automaticity emerges from repeated, low-stress exposure, not from urgency. When you rush the process, your brain stays in monitoring mode. Monitoring mode checks for errors. Learning mode builds patterns. You cannot live in both at the same time. I used to translate everything, word by word, emotion by emotion. That constant switching exhausted me. Psycholinguistics explains why. Code switching consumes executive function resources. The more you translate, the more working memory you burn. Eventually, your brain seeks efficiency. If the environment feels safe, it begins forming direct links between meaning and English words. If it feels threatening, it clings to the old pathway. Americans protect mental health because safety accelerates adaptation. The breakthrough came when I stopped demanding accuracy. I allowed slow English thoughts. Incomplete ones. Childlike ones. This felt uncomfortable at first. My ego wanted polish. My nervous system wanted relief. I chose relief. That choice changed everything. Research on language acquisition shows that tolerance for ambiguity predicts faster fluency. When you accept not knowing, your brain experiments. Experimentation builds fluency. I practice this deliberately. During simple tasks, washing dishes, walking, driving, I narrated in English, slowly. Quietly. No grammar checks. No corrections. Just observation. Water is hot. Traffic is slow. I am tired. These sentences were not impressive. They were functional. Functional language reduces cognitive load. Over time, those simple structures became anchors. More complex thoughts attached themselves naturally. Americans often encourage thinking out loud. This is not just cultural style. It is cognitive strategy. Verbalizing thoughts externalizes processing. It reduces internal pressure. Therapists use this technique to regulate anxiety. I used it to regulate language. When thoughts stayed inside, they tangled. When spoken softly, they straightened. Another shift mattered. I stopped switching languages mid-thought. Even when English felt insufficient, I stayed. Silence instead of translation. Neuroscience supports this restraint. Pausing allows neural pathways to strengthen. Translation interrupts consolidation. Silence feels awkward, but it is productive. Americans are comfortable with pauses. They do not rush to fill them. That cultural tolerance gave me permission to slow down. Sleep played a role too. During rest, the brain reorganizes information. Studies on memory consolidation show that new language patterns stabilize during sleep. When I reduced mental pressure before bed, no drilling, no correction, my dreams occasionally featured English. Fragments. This is a sign of integration, not fluency. Integration. The language was moving in. I also noticed how emotions influence thought language. When calm, English appeared more easily. When stressed, my native language took over. This is normal. Stress activates older neural pathways. Calm allows new ones. Americans protect mental health because calm environments support cognitive flexibility. Flexibility enables bilingual thinking. One mistake I avoided later was comparing inner speech. My English thoughts sounded simpler than my native ones. That difference bothered me until I realized something important. Inner speech reflects current capacity, not intelligence. Children think simply before thinking deeply. Simplicity is not regression. It is construction. I applied this insight to conversations. Instead of planning responses, I listened fully. Listening without planning reduces cognitive load. It creates space for spontaneous English thoughts. Conversation analysis research shows that real-time interaction promotes automaticity more effectively than rehearsed speech. Letting go of preparation improved responsiveness. Here is a concrete exercise that helped me. For 5 minutes a day, I described the present moment in English, aloud or silently. No past. No future. Just now. This reduced complexity. The brain handles present tense input more easily. Over time, present thoughts expanded into opinions, then reflections. Slowly. Naturally. Americans do not glorify speed in mental health contexts. They glorify sustainability. Thinking in English slowly is sustainable. Thinking in English under pressure is not. When you remove urgency, the mind cooperates. If you are waiting for the day English replaces your native language in your head, stop waiting. That is not the goal. The goal is flexibility. The ability to let English appear when needed without fear. That ability grows in calm conditions. Thinking in English slowly taught me patience. With language. With myself. Once patience arrived, fluency followed, not dramatically, but steadily. When English meets identity. There is a quiet moment every language learner reaches, though few talk about it. It is not about vocabulary or grammar. It is the moment you hear yourself speak English and feel slightly unfamiliar. Not wrong. Not embarrassed. Just different. That moment can feel unsettling. You wonder, is this really me? I reached that moment after months of living and thinking slowly in English. And it taught me something deeper than fluency. It taught me about identity. Language is not just a tool. It is a container for personality, humor, politeness, boundaries. When you speak your native language, your identity feels complete and automatic. In a second language, that identity feels thinner at first, less expressive, more cautious. Many learners interpret this as loss. Psychologists interpret it as transition. Research in bilingual identity formation shows that people often develop language-specific selves. These are not fake versions. They are contextual adaptations. In English, I sounded calmer, more direct, less dramatic. At first, I thought I was becoming less myself. In reality, I was discovering another part of myself shaped by a different linguistic environment. American culture values clarity over ornament, directness over implication. That influenced how my English self behaved. I used fewer metaphors. I paused more. I chose simpler words. This was not because my English was limited, but because the culture rewarded simplicity. Language adapts to social norms. The discomfort came from comparison. I compared my English self to my native language self. That comparison was unfair. One had decades of development. The other was young. Developmental psychology reminds us that new identities require time. You do not judge a child's personality against an adult's. Yet language learners often do exactly that to themselves. There was also fear. Fear of losing my original voice. Many immigrants carry this fear quietly. Linguistic research shows that identity loss anxiety can slow language acquisition. When the brain perceives threat to identity, it resists integration. It keeps languages separate. Safety allows blending. What helped was reframing. English was not replacing me. It was revealing different traits. In English, I became more reflective. I listened more. I chose words carefully. These were strengths, not weaknesses. Once I accepted that, resistance softened. Another shift happened in humor. Humor is identity sensitive. Jokes depend on timing, cultural references, and tone. My humor in English was muted at first. That silence felt like absence. Over time, I learned that American humor often values understatement, dryness, self-deprecation. When I stopped trying to translate jokes and instead observed patterns, my humor returned, different, but authentic. Names also matter. When people pronounced my name differently, I felt a small fracture. Sociolinguistics explains that names anchor identity. Hearing your name adapted can feel like erosion. I learned to see it as accommodation, not erasure. Small shifts do not delete origins. One powerful moment came when I defended an opinion in English, not perfectly, but firmly. The thought formed directly in English. The emotion followed. That alignment mattered. It showed that English could carry my values, not just information. Identity lives where values can be expressed. Therapists working with bilingual clients note that emotional expression varies by language. Some emotions surface more easily in one language than another. This is normal. It does not mean emotions are weaker. It means pathways differ. Over time, emotional vocabulary grows. Depth follows. I stopped forcing emotional precision in English. Instead of searching for perfect words, I allowed approximate ones. Approximation reduces anxiety. Anxiety blocks expression. Americans often say, "Close enough." That attitude protects communication. Precision can come later. Another realization surprised me. In English, I felt safer expressing boundaries. Saying no, saying I need time. The language felt less emotionally charged. Linguists call this emotional distancing. A second language can create psychological space. That space can be healthy. This did not mean I loved less or felt less. It meant I could regulate better. Emotional regulation is a key component of adult mental health. English offered a new regulatory tool. Not superior. Complementary. Gradually, the question changed. I stopped asking, "Is this me?" I started asking, "Which part of me is this?" That shift removed conflict. Identity is not singular. It is layered. Language adds layers. I also noticed that Americans rarely question identity changes caused by context. They accept that people act differently at work, at home, with friends. Language is just another context. Once I accepted that, the pressure disappeared. Thinking and speaking in English no longer felt like performance. It felt like participation. Participation does not require perfection. It requires presence. If you ever feel smaller in English, remember this. You are not shrinking. You are building a new room inside yourself. It will feel empty at first, then furnished, then lived in. Language does not steal identity. It expands it if you let it. A happy ending in America. People often expect a dramatic ending when they hear a story about immigration, language, and mental health. They expect a clear victory or a clear failure. My ending is quieter than that. It is not fireworks. It is not perfection. It is stability. And in real life, stability is a form of happiness. One morning, I woke up before my alarm. The house was quiet. The light coming through the window was soft, not demanding. I did not feel rushed. I did not feel heavy. I simply noticed my breath. That moment told me something important. My mind was resting, not escaping, not fighting, resting. I made coffee and stood by the window. Outside, nothing special was happening. A car passed. A neighbor walked a dog. Ordinary American life. And inside me, something felt ordinary too. That was new. For a long time, my inner world was always loud, always translating, always worrying. That morning, English thoughts came and went naturally. Vietnamese thoughts did too. There was no conflict, just flow. Happiness did not arrive as excitement. It arrived as absence of fear. Fear of misunderstanding. Fear of falling behind. Fear of not being enough in a foreign language, a foreign culture, a foreign life. When fear softened, space appeared. In that space, learning became gentle again. My family noticed the change before I did. Conversations slowed down. Arguments became shorter. Silence became comfortable. We were no longer surviving America. We were living in it. That distinction matters. Survival is loud. Living is quiet. English was no longer a test I took every day. It was a tool I used when needed. Some days I spoke more. Some days less. I stopped measuring progress by fluency and started measuring it by ease. Ease in ordering food. Ease in small talk. Ease in asking for help. Ease is a better metric than perfection. There is a common myth that happiness comes when you arrive. Arrive at fluency. Arrive at success. Arrive at confidence. In reality, happiness comes when you stop chasing arrival and start accepting process. America taught me that in an indirect way. The culture emphasizes productivity, but it also normalizes therapy, rest, and boundaries. That balance saved me. My relationship with English became honest. I no longer pretended to understand everything. I asked people to repeat. I clarified. Americans respected that. Clarity builds trust. Pretending builds distance. Once I chose clarity, conversations became lighter. I also forgave myself for the years I spent struggling. I stopped seeing them as wasted time. Those years trained my patience. They forced me to listen deeply. They reshaped my priorities. Without that struggle, I would not value calm the way I do now. Sometimes people ask me, was it worth it? That question assumes a clear exchange rate, pain for reward. Life does not work that way. Some things are not worth it or not worth it. They are formative. They shape who you become. This journey shaped me into someone who understands vulnerability across languages. I am not happier because America is perfect. It is not. I am happier because I learned how to take care of my mind within imperfection. Mental health is not a destination. It is a practice. Language learning is the same. English still challenges me. Some days my words feel clumsy. Some days my confidence dips. The difference is that I no longer panic. I trust recovery. Trust is the real ending. I want to say something directly to you, the listener. If you are learning English and feeling tired, confused, or emotionally distant from yourself, nothing is wrong with you. Your brain is doing complex work. It is reorganizing identity, memory, and emotion at the same time. That is heavy labor. Slow down. Speak slowly. Think slowly. Progress does not disappear when you slow down. It becomes sustainable. Sustainable learning is what lasts. America did not give me happiness. It gave me a mirror. That mirror showed me where I was hurting, where I was rigid, and where I needed care. English was part of that mirror. Not the cause of pain, but the medium through which pain surfaced and healed. My ending is not about success. It is about peace with being unfinished. I am still learning, still adjusting, still growing, and that is enough. So here is my final question for you, and it matters more than grammar or pronunciation. When you think in English, do you allow yourself to be human, or do you demand perfection? If you allow yourself to be human, the language will meet you halfway. And that is where real happiness begins. If you've made it to the end of this story, I want you to pause for a moment. Not to translate, not to repeat, just to feel. Because this video was never only about English. It was about the quiet weight you carry when learning in a foreign language. The pressure to sound smart. The fear of being misunderstood. The exhaustion that comes from trying to be strong every single day. America taught me many things, but the most important one was this. Protecting your mental health is not weakness. It is survival. When Americans slow down, set boundaries, or go to therapy, they are not giving up. They are choosing clarity over chaos. And when you learn English with patience instead of pressure, your brain opens instead of shuts down. If this story touched you, it means you are not lazy. You are not broken. You are simply learning something difficult in a human way. And here's the truth most English channels won't tell you. Real progress happens when your mind feels safe. This channel is built for that purpose. Slow English. Real stories. Life in America. Love, marriage, family, mental health told gently, honestly, and without rush. So if you want to improve your listening, reading, and speaking naturally, learn English through meaningful life stories. Understand American culture, mindset, and emotional life. And protect your mental health while learning. Then subscribe to this channel and stay with me. New long-form stories are coming deeper, calmer, and more real. Stories that don't just teach English, but help you breathe while learning it. Because your mind matters. And your journey deserves patience. Subscribe now and let's keep learning slowly and humanly together.